Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a deep dive of 1 Corinthians, specifically chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. Now, if you're familiar with the Apostle Paul's letters, you already know he often deals with some, pretty messy church dynamics. And let me tell you, the church in Corinth, definitely no exception. But right here, before he even touches their many issues, he lays down this absolutely incredible theological foundation. So today, we're unpacking some rich concepts from our source devotional to see exactly how Paul grounds this fractured community in grace, identity, and the unshakable faithfulness of God. Here's what we're looking at today. First, calling and church identity. Then, the true meaning of spiritual wealth. After that, we'll hit God's faithfulness and hope, and we'll wrap it all up with a meditation for life. Okay, let's get right into it with section 1, calling and church identity. So before calling out their behavior, Paul actually takes a second to establish the absolute bedrock of who this church really is. Our source commentary maps out Paul's opening greeting into 3 very distinct parts. First up, the basis of his apostleship, which rests entirely on God's sovereign call. Second, the identity of the church itself, they're defined as God's possession, called to be holy. And finally, the blessing, grace and peace flowing directly from God the Father and Jesus Christ. Now, do you notice what's completely missing here? Human merit. There's none of it. Paul takes the focus entirely off human achievement and places it squarely on God's sovereignty. To really grasp the weight of Paul's authority here, we have to look at his specific word choice. He uses the Greek word apostolos. And as our source points out, this actually traces back to the Hebrew concept of a shaliach. We aren't just talking about a messenger dropping off a letter. No, this means a person sent with the full delegated authority and will of the sender. Think of a plenipotentiary ambassador. This proves to the Corinthians that Paul's power doesn't come from his own intellect or fancy rhetorical skills. It comes entirely from the God who sent him. And this perfectly illustrates the flip side of the coin for the church itself. Paul uses the word kletos, which literally means being called. The church in Corinth, the ecclesia, didn't just wake up one day and decide to form a self-selected social club for like-minded religious folks. They are a holy gathering, actively called out and separated by God himself. So their entire existence as a community, it's a direct result of divine action, not human organization. Now, let's look at Paul's greeting of peace, because it creates a massive contrast with the culture of that time. Back in the 1st century, the ultimate idea of peace was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But let's be real, this was a peace maintained through heavy military force, strict hierarchies, and the exploitation of conquered people. On the totally opposite end of the spectrum, we have Christ's shalom. This is not just the absence of war, guys. It's a profound, cosmic peace, bringing internal and external reconciliation, and it's achieved entirely through the sacrifice of the cross. That brings us to section 2, true meaning of spiritual wealth. All right, here's where we hit the core problem. The Corinthian church was undeniably spiritually wealthy, but they completely misunderstood what that wealth was actually for. Paul explicitly thanks God that they are enriched in 2 very specific areas, logos and gnosis. In this context, logos, or speech, refers to vocal spiritual gifts, things like speaking in tongues and prophecy. Gnosis, or knowledge, refers to this deep, penetrating understanding of God's mystery of salvation. And Paul isn't being sarcastic here at all. He's acknowledging that they genuinely possess powerful spiritual gifts. They really were that gifted. But here is where we run into a massive cultural collision. See, in the secular Greco-Roman society of Corinth, rhetorical speech and philosophical knowledge were pretty much everything. They were the ultimate status symbols, markers of personal power, and huge grounds for pride. And the Corinthians were taking those secular, status-obsessed cultural values and projecting them directly onto God's spiritual gifts. Basically, they were mistaking unearned divine grace for personal superiority. So Paul has to step in and remind them, hey, these gifts are tools meant to humbly build up the church, not shiny badges of personal honor. Our source text sums this up perfectly with this quote. The problem of the Corinthian church was not a lack of gifts, but ignorance of the purpose of the gifts. Their crisis wasn't a shortage of spiritual power. It was really a tragic amnesia regarding grace. Because they somehow forgot that everything they had was a completely free gift from God, they lost their gratitude. And as we all know, when gratitude vanishes, arrogance moves right in to take its place. Which leads us directly into section 3, God's faithfulness and hope. To resolve the heavy tension of all this spiritual arrogance, Paul does something really interesting.
He pivots away from human failure and points straight to the ultimate security of the believer. He uses this foundational Greek term, bebeo, which means to make firm or establish. Paul is assuring his readers that the foundation of their salvation rests 100% on God's active promise. God is the one who will make them firm until the very end. And honestly, this is a massive comfort, right? Because it means the preservation of the church relies on God's ongoing faithfulness to the gospel, completely regardless of our own human imperfections and stumbling.
Paul goes on to say that God will keep them blameless until the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he's using some pretty powerful legal language here. In a courtroom setting, blameless denotes justification. It's this stunning scenario where sinners who actually deserve condemnation are instead declared perfectly righteous by God's grace. He's reminding the super-fractured, deeply flawed church that standing blameless on the final day is a verdict of pure grace. It is absolutely not a reward for flawless spiritual behavior. And what's the ultimate result of all this divine faithfulness? A profoundly deep fellowship. As our source notes, we aren't just talking about casual socializing over a meal. This is a common union with Jesus Christ. And the thing is, you really can't be in union with Christ without being inextricably linked to one another. This vertical and horizontal fellowship naturally binds the whole community together, and vitally, it protects them. Because if you are that deeply united with Christ, you have no choice but to firmly reject the worldly idols and status symbols that were tearing Corinth apart in the first place.
Let's wrap things up with Section 4, Meditation for Life.
So now that we've done a deep dive into the ancient text, we have to ask the obvious question: how does this rich first-century theology actually apply to our daily lives right now? Our devotional source distills this whole passage into 3 core reflections. First, we've got to remember that our holy identity belongs entirely to God. We are called and named by Him. Second, we need to recognize that literally every ability and resource we possess is unearned grace. We get these abundant gifts not to brag about them, but to serve. And third, we can rest easy. We can trust that God's faithful hands hold us secure, keeping us firm to the very end as we experience true fellowship today.
I've got to say, I absolutely love this perspective from the commentary. It says, when we recognize everything we have as a gift, life can become a festival. I mean, how beautifully does that illustrate the mindset shift Paul was going for? Acknowledging our spiritual wealth as pure, unmerited grace shouldn't make us competitive or prideful. It should produce a heart of joyful, continuous celebration. Once you stop desperately trying to prove your worth through your gifts, life genuinely does become a festival of thanksgiving. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought from today's explainer. Ask yourself this: are your gifts seeds of division or a festival of gratitude? Take a hard, honest look at the talents, the resources, and the spiritual insights you've been given. Are you using them to elevate your own status and create distance between yourself and others, kind of like the Corinthians did? Or are you using them humbly, recognizing them as sheer grace and inviting everyone around you into a shared festival of thanksgiving? It is a crucial question to carry with you. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the depths of what you've been given.